extend a special welcome to our panelists this afternoon. Joining me is Jihad Azur. He is Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. Azulkan Baymagamatov is Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan. Koba Gaventidis is Governor of the National Bank of Georgia. And Martha Olcott is a professor at the Michigan State University. She also joins us here today. So we're looking forward to this discussion. And of course, this is going to be an interactive session. So if you are joining our session live, you also have the opportunity to ask a question. So please go ahead and post any questions you have for our panel on social media. You can use the hashtag IMFCCA, or you can write questions into the Zoom call as well. And you can submit your questions in both English and in Russian, and I'll make sure our guests answer them for you. So let's get the conversation underway. The first theme that we wanted to focus on is the impact of the war and sanctions in the region. And I think, Jihad, we can begin with you because as we know, the IMF has just published its regional economic outlook just recently. And of course, countries in the region have been emerging from the pandemic, but now they've been hit with this new and ongoing shock. So Jihad, over to you first. How do you see the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia affecting the economic outlook for the region compared to some of your earlier forecasts?
Thank you very much, Dan. Also, I would like to welcome everyone on this webinar this afternoon or this morning. 2022, in terms of outlook for the region, is the story of recovery that was taking shape and was disrupted by the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. Given the proximity of most of the Caucasus and Central Asian countries, not only geographically, but economically with Russia, this war affected them directly, which has led to not only to downgrade the growth for this year, but also to notice certain number of developments. Prior to the war, this economy, the region was expected to grow at the level of 5%, but this level of growth has been revised downward. And the reason is the shock affected them directly and also through multiple type of channels. Direct impact because of the strong economic and financial relationship. Most of those countries trade with Russia, have a financial links, have workers working in Russia and strong level of remittances, and also for some have a financial system that is connected to Russia. Therefore, with the war, this had immediate impact on them. For countries like, for example, Tajikistan or Kyrgyz Republic, the level of remittances from Russia exceed 20% of GDP. For Georgia, a country where Koba will tell us more about the situation, the level or the amount of tourists that usually come from Russia is also important. Therefore, direct hit from the crisis, which required immediate response from countries. But also, this crisis had multiple channels or other channels of impact. The global channels were the fact that inflation gradually, and even before the war, was one pressure point on the economies of the region, also added to the tension. In addition to that, the pressure we saw in the international financial markets, especially for emerging economies, had also direct impact on CCA economies. What this has led, it has led to a downgrade growth by depending on oil exporting and oil importing countries, and I'll come to that in less than a minute. Downgrade growth by more than 1.5% this year compared to the projections of October. Of course, the outlook diverged somehow between oil exporting countries in the region, countries like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan and others, where the increase in price of commodities compensated for the impact of all these shocks. But yet their economies has to adjust to that. What are the key challenges? The first one is the immediate one, is how to adjust to the shock, how to reroute certain number of flows of goods and services, how to protect the financial system from any second round risks of sanctions, and also how to provide food security, which is a very important priority. The second challenge is inflation. Inflation is rising, and this year will reach a very high level, which has already led certain number of central banks to both adjust their exchange rate, but also use the monetary policy tool to reduce the risks of inflation. This is an important issue this year. 3 is how to address the impact of the crisis without derailing the public finance stability, especially that for some, the level of debt has increased because of COVID and because also of some of the fiscal policies that were introduced. Therefore, preserving fiscal stability and in the medium term consolidate public finance is important. Last but not the least, this region was in transformation. Trade has increased among countries in the region. And I would say we were witnessing the development of a very vibrant sub-regional integration. This has to be reinvented in a context where investment to also address the scars of the COVID crisis are needed. Investment to upgrade issues like, for example, climate, technology are also priorities. Therefore, we're at a very important moment where policies are going to be key in reducing the impact of the shock, preparing the economies to recover, and also repositioning a region that is now being very close to one of the most critical geopolitical tension in the world.
Indeed, Jihad, and it's so fascinating because for the past 2 years, and perhaps even longer now, we have seen policymakers globally attempting to address some of these issues, in particular, inflation remaining a critical challenge, not just for this region, but for most of the world. How would you say the pandemic has affected the policy space for CCA countries as this new shock hits?
Well, I would say the pandemic was a crisis that affected the whole world, and nobody was prepared for it. If I look back I see what countries have done, I think they have succeeded in preserving lives, despite the challenges that those countries have at a different level. They were able to introduce certain number of measures in order to protect livelihood of people by addressing the problem of small and medium-sized companies, developing certain number of fiscal support measures, as well as also some financing measures. They were in the average of what emerging economies provided in terms of support, but it was done in an efficient way. They also were able to preserve some of the key sectors from the scarring. I take the example again of tourism in Georgia. The measures that were introduced helped reduce the impact of the crisis on this sector. Yet this crisis left certain number of issues and required some time to address them. The one that was growing starting 2021 was, in fact, in form of 2. One is for countries who were slow in vaccinating, had slower recovery. And the second one is the inflation, which is a global phenomena affected those countries. Some countries have been very fast in adapting their policies to reduce the impact of inflation and to maintain their monetary policy anchored. And also we saw the case of the rise in oil price improving the economic outlook for some of the oil exporting countries prior to the shock of the war. Therefore, in general, I would say, and this was translated into the numbers in 2021, a capacity to, despite the challenges that countries have, to address and to start recovering. Of course, it came at a price. The price is that the overall debt vulnerability has increased. The capacity to withstand new shock has been partially eroded, and the need now to be very careful in the way you, for example, introduce social support or subsidy is becoming key because you have a very limited space on the fiscal side, very limited resources, and then countries need to use them wisely.
Indeed, and that challenge remains. Okay, let's bring the conversation over to Deputy Governor Baima Gamatov now. And Deputy Governor, we know countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia are geographically located close to Russia and Ukraine, and they, of course, have deep economic and financial linkages as well. What do you see as the most important direct transmission channels from the war and sanctions for CCA countries now?
Then thank you for the question. Russia really is the largest country in the region with the most developed economy and domestic production compared to other regional economies. It's true. In case of Kazakhstan, the longest land border with Russia makes it one of the most important trading partners for us. For example, for the last year, 42% of import come from the Russia. Therefore, imbalances in the Russian economy and sanctions against it have a direct impact on the economy of Kazakhstan. In current realities, such industries, for example, as wholesale trade or mining can serve as an example. For example, about 95% of Kazakh oil has been exported through the pipelines located on the territory of Russia. It potentially could lead to logistical risk in case of, for example, EU impose sanctions on oil imports from Russia, as some pipelines mix oil exports from Russia and Kazakhstan. This will raise the issue of separating the export from two countries. Now it may be not the real case, but it's one of the risks which we see on the radar. Some inflation links in the share of Russian foods and non-food products in our domestic consumption is really high. The observed acceleration of inflation in Russia, some uncertainty with the dynamic of ruble exchange rate, ban on the export of some strategically important food products like sugar, wheat, it increased the risk for inflation in Kazakhstan. However, it should also be noted that our government is in close talks with the Russian authorities on the matter on case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, it's some risk for inflation. Additionally, logistics schemes and supply chains are disrupted, which can negatively affect not only the retail trade and domestic consumer demand, but also a number of other sectors of the economy. At the same time, the current situation, despite its complexity, creates some new opportunities for the countries of the region to enter other markets, establish direct relations with the international suppliers, rebuild supply chains, establish domestic production, etc. We see that a lot of international manufacturers, they go out maybe from the Russia, and we also should note that some part of the Russian import to Kazakhstan, it was linked to maybe re-export of Russia was like an logistically hub for the whole region, and Kazakhstan is one of the big economy was a recipient of this re-export from the Russia, and now we understand that some trade routes and trade schemes, it should be rerouted again, and it's also some risk for inflation for the trade because it needs time to go. Now we see that the importance of Trans-Caspian transport route may be increasing due to these reasons. In the meantime, the anti-Russian sanctions will affect the countries in the CCA region mainly through some indirect channels also. High oil prices, which Mr. Azur already mentioned, also some indirect results of geopolitical tension and benefiting oil and gas exporter in the region. At the same time, many CCA countries are also exporter of labor force to the Russia, and remittances, it's also the very important issue for some countries in the region. Also like in tourism, maybe it's not the case in Kazakhstan, but for when we speak to the region in whole, I agree that remittances and tourism from Russia, it's also the very important point for region as a whole. For example, when we come to Kazakhstan in context of effect of sanctions on our economies, it's not a simple one. Due to high oil prices, the result of our latest this geopolitical tension, oil exports of Kazakhstan are growing substantially. In the first quarter of this year, our total exports have risen by 66% in comparison with the last year first quarter. And we see, for example, that revenue from the oil exports it's doubled due to the almost double due to the oil prices rising and some additional oil production due to the OPEC Plus deal. But we are not the center of the we are not the receiver of the remittances from the Russia. We mainly maybe center to remittances to the Russia. That's why it not hit Kazakhstan. But when I describe you the inflation, rerouting of import channels, it's very important channels, and the area of our monitoring and close attention to the situation.
And Deputy Governor, as you say, this is a really important point that you're picking up on here, because as you know, we are facing a global energy crisis. The price of oil, Brent and WTI, now well above $100 a barrel. OPEC Plus working to stabilize the market there, but risks remain. Of course, Kazakhstan, one of the world's largest exporters of coal, also a very large exporter of crude oil and natural gas. So what would you say the balance of risks are for energy exporters like Kazakhstan? And can you just speak to the current energy and oil price environment right now? Is any relief on the horizon in your view?
Maybe in short term, no. I don't see any reasons to relief in oil prices, but in middle term, I believe the situation in any case should be cooled, and maybe we will see a little bit lower oil prices, because in my view, prices of the oil, which is higher than $100 per barrel, it's maybe not so, how to say,
sustainable.
Sustainable, okay. Yeah. But we should see the situation.
Let's get another view and bring in Governor Gaventides now. And Governor, as you just heard there, this crisis is having global effects on things like energy prices, for example, but also more recently, we've seen a significant impact on food as well. And it comes as this pandemic continues to hit supply chains, which is fueling inflation, as Jihad mentioned. So how are you assessing the transmission channels of the war and sanctions on CCA countries in areas like food and energy prices?
Thank you, Dan, for this question. And I also want to praise the IMF staff for this regional economic outlook, which characterizes and describes very well situations in this region. To come back to your question, I think that consequences of the war in Ukraine exacerbate an already grave inflationary environment in the world, and also fuels inflationary expectations. And the new reality has already caused upward revision of inflation projections in almost all countries. As both Russia and Ukraine are important producers of food commodities, of course, disruption of operations with these commodities in these two countries have added to global increase in food prices. And let's not forget that this was in addition to increase of food prices, which we already had last year because of COVID pandemic. And of course, this feeds to inflationary pressures in both oil importers and oil exporters of CCA countries. And their impact will stay for some period of time, at least in the short run. Another issue is increasing oil prices, and the Deputy Governor was also talking about it. This is going to impact the higher prices are going to impact inflation is those countries where energy subsidies are not provided. For example, in Georgia, energy subsidies are not provided, so we saw quite a large increase in domestic energy prices. A bit different is gas prices, because for gas prices, there might be some bilateral short-term contracts which may mitigate impact, indirect impact. And for example, there is an agreement between Russia and Armenia. There is also agreement between Georgia and Azerbaijan for contracts, and this will help not to impact inflation that much. I think that very important indirect channel then is generally increasing geopolitical tensions in the region. So now the region is conceived to be more risky than it was before. For example, last week, Moody's, while affirming Georgia's rating of Ba2, it revised its outlook from stable to negative. And the only reason for that was the fact that there was the conflict in the region. I think that a bit more promising is that as time goes, we see that still sentiments of businesses are improving. One very important fact, what happened in Georgia last week, and it was interesting that it really coincided with these discussions which we are having now, it's which I would call sort of unforeseen or indirect, is that we have been expecting that remittances from Russia to Georgia would decline. In any case, it was not large. It was declining over time. It was just 17% of total remittances in Georgia last year. But what we saw last week, it was quite a large increase in remittances from Russia to Georgia. Possibly this is a consequence of migration, which happened to Georgia after this conflict. And it helped markedly it helped to our national currency to appreciate. And of course, it is going to help to ease imported inflation in Georgia. But another side of the coin is that we have to see whether it is one-off or how sustainable that can be. Because if it's reversed, lari may experience pressure. Exchange rate may experience pressure again. So we have to be very careful on that. So this is mostly on oil importers. This is how we see indirect channels. As for oil exporters, they will benefit from a rise in energy prices, but of course, high global food prices will still impact inflation in all countries, including oil exporters and oil importers. And one more last point regarding your question is that we are still in the environment of high uncertainty. To put it in a simple way, it is difficult to make projections in this environment because there are developments which could not have been foreseen before. For example, when the war started, before the war, GDP growth for Georgia for this year was forecasted at about between 5 and 6%. After the war, we saw depreciation of the currency, we saw some nervousness, and we reduced projection to 3.5%. But recently, we saw quite a large activity and increase of demand in Georgia, maybe also due to the very stable banking system in the country, increasing tourist income, and recently also remittances as well. And we revised our projection of GDP upwards. So now it is, we project it at 3.5%. So this kind of uncertainty creates a lot of indirect impact. And we of course have to follow and analyze from which direct corner they approach us and what impact they are having on the policies. And then we need to adjust our policies consequently. Thank you.
So, Governor, just as a follow-up on that, there are a number of policy levers that you can pull to influence things like inflation, for example, or to even have an indirect impact on the exchange rate. But so many factors that are influencing the outlook for Georgia and this crisis right now are ultimately, as you say, beyond your control. Things like global inflation, things like geopolitical uncertainty and other issues stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So how do you respond to that, and what does it mean for the country's economic trajectory from here?
Sorry, yeah. So my microphone was on mute. Yes, there are exogenous factors on which we cannot do much. For example, the tightening of monetary policy in advanced economies. Of course, those countries have to take care of situation in higher increasing inflation. Of course, I think that the best remedy then in the situation, what I think is that to make sure that we implement, first of all, coordination between fiscal and monetary authorities on the actions. In this challenging time, it's absolutely important. And second of all, it is continuation of sound macro policies. We have to make sure that whatever assistance is given, for example, to the economy, to the population which are affected, are given in a transparent way, in a targeted assistance. And at the same time, we need to understand where we need to stop that and when it should not become excessive. And at the same time, having always in check financial system is very important. You, of course, remember that during the pandemic, we released a lot of buffers in the financial system, and when pandemic situation improved, we asked the banks, like other regulators, to recover, to rebuild these buffers. Right now, it is helping us, but we always need to make sure that we understand very well what is happening in the situation and make actions as quickly as possible. And last point on this, for example, when we saw the pressure on exchange rate on national currency after the war, we recalibrated some macroprudential regulations to make sure that we preemptively address the issue of increasing dollarization in Georgia. And dollarization is not only a problem of Georgia in the region, but it's very wide a problem of the region. So these kind of very proactive measures are necessary to take from time to time once we look at the development of the situation.
Thank you, Gava. Let's bring in Professor Olcott now, who's been waiting patiently as the conversation rolls on. Professor, welcome into the conversation. Thanks for joining us. When we look at the situation here, there could be other effects as well, especially if international sanctions are here to stay. So what's your view on this, and what impact is the war and sanctions having? And to a deeper point, could this also shape perceptions of how the region is perceived, I guess, when it comes to attractiveness for investment?
Thank you. I think that for me, when I think about what the impact of the war is, the question that I have two real sets of concerns. One, and I think that the last speaker has touched on part of that, is the inability to predict what comes next. And I think to the degree to which, especially the Central Asian economies, are so completely dependent, maybe too strong, but have such strong ties to Russia, and at least specifically with Kazakhstan as a big border country with Russia, have concerns about the potential of the various levers that Russia can exert to try to modify their behavior. So for me, at least thinking about moving forward, I think if I was sitting in a Central Asian seat, I would be worried about what unpredictabilities are still out there vis-a-vis Russia's behavior. If the situation in Ukraine continues to remain difficult for Russia militarily, will Russia begin to make new demands on its neighboring states? The second set of concerns that I have really are the fact that I think it's really important to put the perspective of the impact of the war on whether they will exacerbate the existing structural problems in the economy. In these economies, will there be enough leadership power? I mean, enough creative thinking on the part of the leadership to be able to sustain public support through increasingly difficult economic times. And in terms of,
ask you, sorry, sure. Professor, finish your thought.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to ask, do you think there could be any unexpected upsides for some of these CCA countries, for example, when it comes to inward migration or reorientation of trade and investment towards the region? You also mentioned a really great point there when it comes to the uncertainty, I guess you could say, about what Russia is exactly going to do next. What does that mean for neighboring countries? Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that for me?
Sure. Let me take the positive first, because you asked about immigration and attractiveness for investment. I think that the potential for attractiveness for investment is really there. And that will also, I think, go back to the same creativity problem. I think that if the leadership can move forward with structural reforms, and we might want to talk more about that in the next set of questions, then I think that the attractiveness of investment throughout the region will increase. And I do think immigration, especially white-collar immigration, has really been important for many of these countries. In terms of your other question about unpredictability, I think we saw a good example of not realized risk, but what unpredictability is like when the leaders of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, gathered last week with President Putin, and only the president of Belarus spoke positively about the war in Ukraine, and everybody else stayed amazingly silent on those questions. Right. Russia didn't respond with using any levers, but the levers, of course, are for Kazakhstan, Russia talking about treatment, what they could term ill treatment of a Russian language population. Anybody who shares a 7,000-kilometer border with another country, let alone a country that's invaded its second largest border country, is really one that has what to be nervous about. Although I don't think we should exaggerate the potential for these risks. I think they're there and everybody's aware of them. But right now, there's very little sign of them being exacerbated.
And very little sign of resolution, I guess you could say as well, which is the most interesting thing for me. It's still unknown as to how long all of this is going to play out. So certainly a lot to keep in focus. This has been a great conversation so far. I just wanted to remind our viewers and our audience that if you are joining us live, you can submit your questions for our panelists. You can use the hashtag online. It is IMFCCA, or you can also use the chat function on Zoom to write in your questions for our guests. You can also write in either English or in Russian, and we'll be able to get those questions answered for you. So let's shift our focus now and focus on our second theme, which is policy trade-offs and priorities. And Governor Gaventides, I wanted to bring you back in on this because, as we've been discussing, the IMF's latest forecast shows a combination of both weaker growth and higher inflation in all CCA countries, which is a real concern. The food price increases are particularly steep, which we've discussed. It could also have a flow-on effect on social stability, which is interesting as well. And as Jihad mentioned, the policy space has been reduced since the pandemic began. So in your view, what are the measures that policymakers should be prioritizing in addressing this trade-off?
Then, thank you for this question. Let me give you 2 points from the central bank's point of view and from the fiscal authorities' point of view. And as I said in my previous response, there should be coordination between those authorities in these difficult times. There is no question about it. As you mentioned, inflation is a big issue now everywhere. And central banks face a very difficult task to find a fine line and to balance the trade-offs between surging inflation and weakened growth prospects. What we have chosen in our case is that once we saw quite rapid increase of food prices, commodity prices, and also fearing secondary effects of these developments, we decided to tighten monetary policy early on. So starting from the middle of 2021, we already started tightening. I think these, in combination of very well-functioning and well-capitalized banking system, still gave quite a good combination, because we were able to keep inflation anchored and at the same time let economy grow. Last year, for example, Georgian economy real growth was 10.4%. Of course, then another challenge came from the war in Ukraine. So it made central banks' tasks even worse. But even in this situation, we think that tight monetary policies in countries is absolutely important to make sure that inflation remains anchored and it does not spill over into expectations, because fighting expectations of inflation will be much more costly. And if tightening is done later than the sooner, then it will require even higher tightening of monetary policy, which will then definitely impact economic growth. And now from the fiscal authority side, of course, they are also facing quite important and difficult dilemma. But what they have to take into account, first of all, is that they have to pay absolutely due attention to most vulnerable groups of the population, because let's not forget that the poorer household tend to spend larger proportion of their income on food and energy. And they clearly suffer the most in this situation. That is why they need to be provided necessary support. And for this, it is necessary to have safety and well-defined safety net, and authorities should always take care of this to make sure that they upgrade it and they have it ready. So even though fiscal space might be narrowing in this situation, assistance to most vulnerable through targeted transfers is absolutely important, because otherwise it may result in social unrest and in long-lasting impact on most vulnerable countries in our situation. And once the economy recovers back well, high debt levels will be also addressed, revenues will also recover, and countries will be able to maintain fiscal sustainability and at the same time address inflationary pressures.
While also addressing some of the concerns that some of the most vulnerable members of the community have. Deputy Governor Bаймагаматov, in addition to the challenge of weaker growth and high inflation, which you're also very welcome to speak to, policymakers are also considering the impact of the sanctions against Russia on their own financial systems. So how would you say the crisis has affected the region's financial systems and things like cross-border payments, for example, and even banking relationships?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Dan. Firstly, I try to add a little bit to the Koba's answer about the growth and inflation. It's really one of the important topics for the central bank over the world. We see that really since the reopening of the economies after the COVID, we see really very good growth over the world, and also we see that inflation has been rising. Also, it's a global problem. For example, that we see that from one side, global GDP growth last year turned to be fastest in more than 40 years. And also we see that, for example, in advanced economy, the inflation is also hit the decades record level. And for our economy, Kazakhstan, GDP increased by 4.1% last year. For this year, we see not the big growth now. It's for first quarter, it was a 4.4%. And I agree with the Koba that we let economy to grow, and we also start to tighten our monetary policy last year. We raised our base rate last year 3 times by a total of 75 basic points. And in this year, it was really our reaction for the geopolitical shocks from one side, and from other side, it was a reaction for the increase in the inflation. We also raised our base rate by 425 base points up to the 14%. It's really very high level, I agree. But it's what we say about the growth and inflation. I see that we still have a space for economy to grow in that cases, and the inflation, it's for me, it's very very important topic, and I completely agree with the Koba that it's hit the mostly the poor population, which for them the food prices and energy, it's a very big share of their consumption, and really it's a big problem for them. And now I try to go to another part of your question for the financial systems, payments, etc. What about the financial system? Really, yes, we have 3 banks, which is a subsidiary of Russian banks. All of them are on the sanction list, unfortunately. The sanction on those banks triggered M&A activity in banking sector. We already have see that one of the bank bought by local bank, and it's now they're working on rebranding and clearing it from the sanction. Other banks are experiencing control outflow of depositors, but they still functioning and still can operate in ruble and tenge. Western currencies, understandable, are not available for them. It creates some limits in their operation and in their functioning on the territory of tenge, of Kazakhstan. From our side, to minimize the pressure on financial market and to promote price and financial stability, we undertake several measures. I already describe our policy on the monetary policy side about the base rate. Also, government and central bank announced the tenge deposits protection program. We will add extra 10% for local depositors. It's the measure which give us the possibility to control the dollarization level, maybe more or less the same problem issue which Koba pay attention. Yeah, it's for financial market. What about the payments? It's understandable that sanction against Russia, it's our main trading partner. It's indeed making payments to Russia problematic, especially when it comes to proceeds in US dollars and euros. For instance, banks have intensified their compliance procedures to mitigate the risk of secondary sanction. But in any case, Russia being our biggest trading partner, when it comes to import, the authorities of 2 countries are looking for ways to minimize the damage to mutual trade. But we also should thinking about the secondary sanction effect. It's really very not easy question to both sides. What about the imports? We already a little bit discussed it in last question, but yeah, what we see that some part of the Russian import to Kazakhstan, it's really the re-export of from the Western markets, or it's the local production of some international suppliers and manufacturers which go out from the Russia, and we see that maybe some trade reroutes should be in place in the middle term. That's why maybe some imports from Russia will change in the future. What about the remittances? We already a little bit discussed it. It's for some countries from the region, it's very important part of the economies, and I believe we see some changes in that area. And recently, World Bank already issued a paper on that, and they expected some fall in remittances. It's also very important topic. About the oil, we already discussed. It's hit the oil prices. Maybe it's our. I believe it's the main areas of different impacts of this conflict. And okay. I agree with the COBA that inflation and food inflation, it's really the conflict give some additional impact on the food inflation. We should take into account that Russia and Ukraine, both countries are one of the major wheat producers. And yes. We see that, for example, FAO index, which shows the international food prices, they hit the record level since the inception of the index in 1990. It's now the historic level of this food price index. It's also one of the spillover of this global geopolitical tension.
Yes, and just quickly, Deputy Governor, because I wanted to get over to Professor Olcott next on this, but what you have outlined here is that critical transactions are being undermined as a result of the sanctions that are in place. Do you see risks intensifying in the period ahead? Because I get the sense there's not going to be any sanctions relief on Russia anytime soon.
We don't have any sanction on Kazakhstan, and we working on the. It's a very important topic. Yeah, we should work very careful in this area. But yeah, Russia, in any case, it's our important trade partner, and we have a very big border with Russia. And some trade between us, it's very natural. That's why, yeah, banks seeking the possibility to serve the trade from one side and to avoid the secondary sanction risk from other side.
Let's bring it over to Professor Olcott for more on this. And Professor, you could probably also speak to this as well, but on another level, CCA countries we know have faced long-term structural challenges even before the pandemic started, and the spillovers that we are seeing today from the war, as you've just heard. Do you think authorities are on the right track, staying the course of economic reforms, or does much more need to be done here, given the fact that, as I just mentioned, sanctions relief not coming anytime soon when it comes to the secondary impact of these sanctions on countries that surround Russia and have close trade and economic ties with Russia?
I wish that I could be more optimistic. I do, on the positive note, I do think that the governments in the region, and I am speaking more especially about Central Asia, which I know better, are more aware now of the importance of meeting the structural economic challenges that they have. This certainly, it's not that these leaders needed awakening, but they certainly have had a fast awakening. I'm not sure, though, that they're going to be able to engage in the kinds of structural reforms that they need, that they will have the capacity to, and maybe even to have the capacity to reform their economies, to do structural reforms, especially reducing the role of the state in the economic sector quickly enough to meet what is certain to be rising popular demands for change. We see in Kazakhstan, we have seen things blow up in Kazakhstan in January, which reflected a degree of the inherent tension in society, although that's certainly to get a good explanation of what happened and who is the source and the cause is very difficult. But it does speak to popular pressures. And these pressures are sure to increase as prices continue to increase globally. I wish I could be more optimistic about the capacity of these governments to react quickly enough. And I want to throw in one more thing very, very quickly, which is the question of the amount that the international community is going to be able, the degree to which they're going to be able to continue their level of engagement in these countries as the need for rebuilding Ukraine and compensating and working with the enormous refugee crisis that's come to those neighboring countries as well. So that to me exacerbates the need for faster economic policy making, economic structural change in Central Asia. This is their window now, and if they don't get it right, then I'm nervous about what comes later.
Yeah, Professor, you got it. And you also make an important point about reducing reliance on the state, which I know is something that you focus on as well. Do you think the prospects for fostering stronger private sector-led growth and diversification have changed as a result of the war as well?
I think the prospects have it. I think the prospects for it have changed, have improved. But to me, there remains a question of whether there is enough both capacity on the part of the governments to introduce this structural change. And capacity also is partly measured by the ability to attract in the kind of economic reformers into government service to make these changes occur, and for the leadership itself, the most senior leadership, to be willing to be criticized by the elite around them, by the if we can use the term oligarchic, or at least powerful domestic business interests that don't necessarily want to see the same degree of structural reform. I can see a debate in each of these countries in the business elite as to how fast structural reform should occur and whose shoulders it should fall on. It's hard to agree to be a loser if you've been powerful.
I like that point. Very good point. And Professor, can I just follow up with one more question here? This is going to open a big can of worms, but what about when it comes to the issue of climate change? Of course, increasingly important globally, increasingly important for this region. How are prospects for actually dealing with this great moral challenge of our time changing as a result of the situation on the ground there?
Thank you for that question. I've thought a lot about it. And, you know, since we've begun talking about this event. And on the one hand, the Central Asian states and the Caucasian states as well, but especially in Central Asia, there's been an awareness of the risks of climate change way before the international community tuned in on this question. This was one of the main issues at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was in terms of water management issues, excessive use of fertilization, the problem of flooding, regional flooding and earthquakes. And here I think, especially on water management issues in Central Asia, there has been considerable success, especially with control management of the Sir basin in regional cooperation. The Amu Darya has been more problematic, but I think here there's this awareness. We don't have to have government learning on the importance of this. This has been an issue that has been at the core of talking about agricultural reform and economic reform in the countryside for over 30 years. Whether they have all the answers, I can't say. But again, nobody has all the answers. But on a positive note, the capacity for regional cooperation, especially within Central Asia, has been increasing the last 4 or 5 years. And we see more evidence of that since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, especially between the two largest economies in the region, between the leaderships of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And Turkey is also playing a role in fostering regional cooperation among Turkish language states.
Indeed. So,
and if I may, just very quick comment on your last point, because you mentioned climate challenge. I think that Rio Economic Outlook also notes very well that this is an important issue for the region. And I think we have to pay more and more attention to this. It has not been that common for central banks to pay attention to these issues before, but now you see more and more attention paid to these issues. In the National Bank of Georgia, we started to look at this already like 3 years ago. We already issued roadmap for sustainable finance in Georgia. We requested commercial banks to provide information about how they are incorporating ESG, environment, social and governance indicators in their financial products. And we think that this is going to be very good for better attraction of resources in the financial system. So I think this is an important matter. And as Professor Olcott also mentioned, regional cooperation in this area is important, and it will definitely bear the fruits in the future.
Indeed, and I wanted to have Jihad come back into the conversation here to tie all of this together for us. Jihad, of course, the IMF has a key role to play here to support countries emerge from this. Just outline some of the IMF support and policy advice that's on offer that is attempting to help to shape the recovery in this region. Talk us through what the IMF is actually doing here as a result.
Thank you, Dan. I think we had very interesting discussions so far that in fact reflect what the fund is doing in the region. First is, especially since the outbreak of the war, is to highlight the challenges that countries of the region are facing because of that. Several in the discussion highlighted certain number of issues. I would summarize them into three: disruption, spillovers, and also the impact of policies. We saw a certain number of disruption trends that have affected the region and several countries in a severe way. And those are important issues that countries need to deal with. And we came very quickly in order to highlight the importance of those. What are the risks in terms of food security, for example, for countries? What are the impact of this war on the financial system stability, and so on? And during the spring meetings a few weeks ago, we had the opportunity with several delegations to see what type of issues they are facing in terms of policies. But also the other issue is the issue of spillovers. And here, I think the one that comes to our mind is inflation. Inflation is a serious issue that requires from countries in the region to address it in order to avoid having the anchoring of inflation expectations and destabilizing the overall macroeconomic stability. And three, we are seeing certain acceleration of trends. For example, the risks of fragmentation would affect more countries like Caucasus and Central Asian countries that are, in fact, at the crossroad between big blocs. Therefore, the first mission we had is to highlight those challenges, raise awareness around them, and try to think collectively with decision makers in the region about how to address them. The second priority is, we know what are the challenges now. We need to make sure that inflation is under control. We need also to preserve the stability of the monetary system through maintaining the flexible exchange rate and protect the financial system. And we need to monitor the shocks. This is what central banks are doing. We had here two very good examples of what needs to be done, because we saw immediate impact of this crisis on the exchange rate situation of some of those countries. Countries have reacted to that, introduced certain number of measures to address those shocks. The second important dimension that we are helping countries with, both in terms of policy support and financial support, is how to maintain fiscal sustainability in a time where inflation is high, and inflation is driven by headline inflation, food and commodity prices. And in certain countries, you still have legacies in terms of subsidy system that has an impact on the fiscal. At a time where the fight against COVID had led to increase the level of debt and therefore reduce the room to maneuver fiscally. Therefore, all these elements are important, maintaining fiscal stability, fiscal sustainability, while supporting those who are directly affected by the crisis and preserve social stability is important. It was mentioned as more than one occasion, is if opportunities come, how to seize them. If you don't have the structural reforms in place, it's very difficult to seize them. Marta was mentioning the importance of reforming the state. we have recently issued a very deep paper on how to reform SOEs. Reforming SOEs in Caucasus and Central Asia is one of the key avenues in order to allow private sector to lead growth and to create additional space for private sector to invest. This is going to be very important because, as Koba mentioned, we are seeing now other countries' issues affecting the stability and attractiveness of investment. When rating agencies factor in the regional geopolitical context into your rating, it means that you have to address some of those issues. Therefore, this complexity of policymaking is what will make the difference today. And this is where the fund is helping. Where the fund is helping is by providing capacity to think together, and this is something that we do regularly with decision makers. We did it a few weeks ago with ministers and governors of the region. By also doing some analytical work recently, we did both on climate and on inflation, some specific work on the impact on the region, but also financially. Financially here, we have provided recently immediate impact during COVID in form of rapid facility. And last year, we provided through the SDRs, the special drawing rights, capacity for central banks and for governments to increase their liquidity. And we were not expecting what happened in 2022, but we knew that there would be some ripple effect of the COVID crisis because we were seeing inflation going up. We were seeing some tension in terms of global coordination. And this year, we have developed the new instruments to help in the long-term transition. Climate is going to be an important issue, a macro important issue for the years to come. We have developed a new facility for that. But I would say over and above all of that, we are trying to foster regional cooperation. Marta mentioned the importance of bringing together countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan as two anchors in Central Asia in order to bring more through cooperation attractiveness in the region. We are also trying to link more the region to other parts of the world. Some of them are oil exporting. By developing links with MENAP oil exporting, this is also an opportunity to accelerate or to open up new routes for a landlocked region. And also Europe is an important partner. It's an important partner for Koba in Georgia, for Armenia, for other countries. And therefore, it's very important now when we are seeing certain number of transformation, not to have those countries being lost because of this big transformation. The issue that we are also trying to address is how to help countries calibrate policies. Again, I think this year is going to be the year of policies, because if you react late, or if, for example, you don't have the right policy measures, you could weaken further. And in certain cases, it would require a stronger adjustment going forward to stabilize the situation. The region has been able, Dan, over the last few years, to do a certain number of improvements since 2015, when the region has faced a double whammy shock. And we saw greater flexibility in the exchange rate, addressing some of the financial sector issues, improving on the fiscal management, and therefore preserving those is one important priority. And the fund is among other institutions, ready and very much dedicated to help in this.
So we have some excellent questions coming through from our audience. So I wanted to put some of those questions to our panelists now, and just taking a look at some of them, a lot of the themes that we have already discussed, but now our audience asking for more information and more detail on them. So the first question is for Jihad and for Koba. Jihad, while we have you, I think you can begin with this one. The question is, how will the economy of Georgia be affected because of the war in Ukraine? And part two of the question is, what are the IMF's main recommendations to the Georgian government? What should we do in order to mitigate the risks of the war in Ukraine? Jihad, first to you.
Well, thank you very much. I will leave the question on the impact to Koba, because he knows better. He is at the, at the pulse of the situation. But what the fund is doing is the fund has reacted very quickly, and we have already been in discussion with Georgia for a program. We have reached staff level agreement, and the program now is taking its way to the board for final approval. The fund and Georgia has a strong relationship. We have been helping Georgia in ambitious reform programs in the past. And this time, it's also an opportunity to help not only address the stabilization issue, but also the transformation issue. And one of the important pillars of the program then is how to improve the economic attractiveness by reforming SOEs. This is an important priority for Georgia. The fund is partnering with Georgia on that. But I think Koba can tell you a bit more on the direct impact and how this is affecting the economy and its performance. Koba?
Yes, thank you, Jihad. Yeah, definitely. Let me give you very, very brief view about the outlook. The Georgian economy weathered pandemic shock then quite well. Considering the challenge which it put on not only in Georgia but globally. As I already mentioned, 2021 real growth was close to, about 10%. Main impact, direct impact, which we see this year is coming from elevated food and energy prices. At the same time, some disruptions, potential disruptions from tourist sector. But as I already mentioned, as time goes, we change our projections based on the developments. For this year, our projection for economic growth is 4.5%. For inflation, on average, we think that inflation will be close to 8%. And what is most important in this situation is how the economy is dealing with it. I have to note that because of sound macro policies, Georgia's economy became resilient to shocks. Of course, shocks are not desirable, but unfortunately, they come and they hit to economies from time to time. And the implementation of right policies is the best defense. In case of Georgia, maintaining floating exchange rate and letting exchange rate absorbing the shock is very important. And I think this is what we have to continue down the road. So I think that prospects are quite good, I have to say, but again, the issue of uncertainty which prevails today, we have to pay attention. And on a general basis, and it's not only about Georgia then, but generally for all countries of CCA, I guess the best defense to make sure that we deal with any type of crisis is what John Kennedy said back in 1962. So the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. So we have to make sure that in good times, we build buffers and we implement structural policies and reforms to make sure that we are ready for the challenges. Thank you.
We have another question from the Zoom chat. This one coming from Lila, actually at the Asian Development Bank. So welcome to you, Lila. Thanks for joining us today. Her question is regarding banking exposure. The question is, banking sectors in many CCA countries have been vulnerable to external shocks, as seen after the 2014-15 oil price slump. Should we expect a rise in non-performing loans in the near future due to these new economic shocks? And what about the surge in bank account openings by Russians? Can this help to improve liquidity for CCA banks? Who would like to answer that question?
Akiljan, please, and after that,
maybe I comment a little bit. Yeah, it's a good question. I need to mention that in Kazakhstan, shortly before this current shock, the AQR asset quality review, its full scale really asset quality review was conducted. and I believe that it made our financial system much more prepared to shock that it was before in 2014-15. Generally speaking, we don't expect some rapid deterioration of asset quality, and we must more prepared that time than it was before. In terms of liquidity, I should highlight that for Kazakhstan, liquidity not the problem for our market. We maybe Jihad know that we have a little bit another problem with the liquidity. It's a lot of liquidity, and we have a structural proficit of liquidity on the market, and opening of Russian accounts in Kazakhstan can be viewed in the context of maybe some market development or relocation of Russian companies in Kazakhstan, but not in the context of liquidity support, or something like this. Thank you.
Yes.
Would anyone else like to speak to that question?
Yes, let me also add a few points to this. I think then the very important test for the challenge for the banking system, for financial system, was pandemic. And if you look at the countries, not in the region but globally, those countries who implemented reforms, especially after 2008 financial crisis. In technical terms, if I say, those who implemented Basel III requirements and regulations dealt with this crisis quite well. Of course, there were difficulties, but even in these difficult situations, those reforms paid. In Georgia, for example, we non-performing loans last year deteriorated from just 3% of the total loans to about 7%. We expected even a bit more deterioration, which did not happen. And then banks started to rebuild the buffers. So I think that the main issue for banks, for financial systems, for dollarized economies like Georgia will be coming from the pressure on exchange rate. And that is why it is important to make sure that we address the issue of dollarization, which cannot be done overnight, but still the measures need to be taken as market-friendly measures as much as possible. So I think that with this approach, financial system will be able to withstand. And there was also one part of the question about the sanctions. In Georgia, we also had a subsidiary of the sanctioned Russian bank, and we made sure to take actions as quickly as possible, because right after the announcement of the sanctions, we instructed Georgian financial system representatives to observe the sanctions introduced by EU, by the United States, by United Kingdom, because Georgian financial system is integrated to global financial system. And I think that this is the best defense to make sure that banks keep their corresponding accounts and they continue financing of the economy. Thank you.
We also have another question from Voice of America News. This one is for Jihad and Deputy Governor Baima Gamatov. The question is, are there any integrated steps that Central Asian financial systems or banks are taking to deal with the effects of the Western sanctions on Russia? The question goes on to say, are there any new agreements, examples of cooperation? Can the region's banks fight the impact together? There's a deep level of concern that the Russian war in Ukraine and its impacts will slow the reforms in Kazakhstan. Some experts and those pushing for political and economic reforms even fear the process may not start at all. If they have already started, where exactly? Any examples?
Well, let me maybe start to give some time for Deputy Governor to reflect on the question related to Kazakhstan. There are several issues here raised in this question. The first one is on the financial system side. One, I think it's important to understand what are the risks here. The risks are risks of secondary sanctions or correspondent banking relationship. And I think most of the central bankers in the region have already been in contact with different correspondent banks as well as also authorities in order to address and provide additional informations to reduce any risk that could emerge from secondary sanctions. The second risk is an economic risk. I think Koba alluded to it. You have the legacy of COVID crisis, and you have the increase in inflation and the volatility you see in the global financial system. Last year, we did an assessment of the banking system in the region and its capacity to withstand the shock. And both in terms of solvency, in terms of liquidity, we were comforted that even if you stress test those systems, they are still able to withstand the shock of the COVID or a shock of economic downturn. Yet there are definitely certain number of issues that have emerged with the COVID crisis, because certain number of measures were introduced at that time to preserve access to finance. And therefore, by unwinding some of those measures, you will see some of the increase in non-performing loans. Central banks and governments need to deal with that. Related to this is how to deal with Russian banks existing in those countries. And I think both we saw in Kazakhstan and Georgia and also in other countries, certain immediate steps made in order to reduce the risks on their financial system. Last but not the least, the issue is we are in a highly uncertain moment with increase in inflation, with also an outlook that is uncertain on the oil market. It's very important to remain vigilant in managing financial markets and the financial sector stability. And this is something that here we need to separate between oil exporting countries and oil importing countries. Oil exporting countries don't have an issue of liquidity because they have additional windfall. The issue becomes more important to deal with is for oil importing countries. And there are certain questions related to Kazakhstan. I will maybe revert to Deputy Governor to address those.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a very important question. I agree with Mr. Azur that it's very important, and we deal in the situation like many central banks in over the world and in the region. It's quite common practice, and we see that really, yeah, in US dollars, in euro, the payments are going with some delays and with some extra compliance, yeah, procedures, etc. In terms of solvency and liquidity, our banking system, I believe it's in good fit, and we already discussed and noted that the liquidity not is a problem in case of Kazakhstan, and we come to this shock more prepared than it was before. And the main risk, it's a risk of secondary sanction from one side. From other side, yes, we should to serve the bilateral trade between the Russia and Kazakhstan. It's also very important topic for our economic development, etc. In terms of some structural reforms that I see that, and I believe that the government will go in further and deepen the structural reform, and we will discuss it with the IMF in forthcoming mission from IMF to Kazakhstan. Yeah, maybe it's and from the On a banking sector side, yeah, I already mentioned that we see that M&A process already started, and one of the Russian secondary banks subsidiary was sold to local investor, to local Kazakhstan investor, and now they in the process of rebranding, and it's one of the possible way how to reduce the spillovers from this situation, maybe. Yeah.
Another question here from Georgia Formula TV, and this one is for Koba. The question is, inflation is rising globally amid the war, despite central banks' attempts to combat it with tight monetary policy. How can governments in the Caucasus deal with inflation? And do you think the priority today should be economic growth, for instance, investing more on infrastructure, which can put pressure on prices somewhat? Or do you think it's not the right time for governments to increase demand when prices are at peak highs already?
Yeah, the answer on this is that we have to try both together, authorities, in which case it's the government as a central bank, to find the fine line. The monetary policy should be conducted in a way to make sure that we fight inflation, but at the same time, we have to avoid derailing the recovery of the economy. At the same time, governments need to make sure that they take care of needs for, first of all, health. Let's not forget that pandemic is not over yet, that they allocate expenditures to most needed, as we already discussed, and at the same time to make sure that they continue investing in some infrastructure projects which will be necessary to make sure that there is a sustainable economic growth. I mean, to put the questions like this, so what is the highest priority? I think that issue of inflation is very important, because if not taken care of, it will definitely spill over into expectations. But at the same time, we have to realize that there are certain factors on which nothing work. When oil prices increase, when food prices increase, part of that, they have to be reflected in domestic inflations. Otherwise, fighting with these exogenous factors, especially for inflation targeters, will be very counterproductive. So I think that communication is a situation very important. So what the central bank is doing about it, what we are doing to make sure that inflation remains anchored. And I think Jihad also mentioned that we have a good relationship with the IMF. And why this is important? Because we implemented a program which was supported by IMF and which helped us quite a lot during pandemic times. And we have reached staff level agreement, and we will soon be starting the program, provided that it's approved by the IMF board. But under the program, we make sure that we have balanced approaches, both in terms of fiscal sustainability, in terms of debt sustainability, and in terms of growth, and in terms of addressing inflationary pressures. So again, very close coordination and looking at the medium term and long-term challenges is very important in this issue. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, Governor. And we are rapidly running out of time, but I did just want to give the floor over to Jihad just for a moment to give us some final and perhaps some closing thoughts. Jihad, anything more you'd like to add before we finish our session?
Thank you very much, Dan. Let me again thank everyone on this webinar. Definitely, we are gathered at a moment where the outlook is very challenging, uncertain, yes, but also offering certain number of opportunities to rethink few important elements. One is, are the policies right to strengthen the fundamentals of the economy? What one could take away from to alleviate the pressure through policies, i.e. reduce the level of uncertainties. And this is the role of monetary policy as well as also fiscal policy. I think the issue of communicating those policies is very important to anchor expectations. Three, we are in a moment of big transformation that would require a certain number of structural reforms. We did not have enough opportunity to discuss those. We alluded to the importance of, for example, climate change. Those are critical in building, I would say, the next curve of recovery and growth. The energy transition, especially that some of the countries in the region are also energy exporters. The climate improvement, especially that climate is negatively affecting not only the economic activity, but also social stability, and how to diversify and use climate as driver for job creation, how to address issues of informality that has been one of the key challenges that did not allow social policies, for example, to be the most effective, and how to use technology as transformative way to position those economies. Of course, to counter this high level of uncertainty that is emerging because of the situation in the region, the war in Ukraine, and the sanctions on Russia, it's an opportunity to rethink also the cooperation in the region. The position of the region as one of those important hubs and nodes that could become, I would say, more strategic and more important to the global economy, but also to the neighboring regions. And therefore, I think it's a moment where countries in the region could rethink that how this crisis could help them strengthen some of their economic ties, reduce barriers, increase intra-regional trade, open up to other routes in terms of supply chain. Therefore, it's a moment where you have to be extra vigilant in order to preserve the stability of your economy, to do it in an inclusive way, to avoid that those who are in a weak situation not to be left behind, and to charter the course of the future through structural reforms.
A very nice way to conclude our session. Jihad, thank you so much. And thank you to all of the IMF team for putting this exceptional panel together. Governor, Deputy Governor, Professor, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your analysis as well. That concludes our session. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are in the world. We're looking forward to having the conversation again soon. And with that, we will wrap it up. Thanks again to everyone for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.